The bank said the crumbling estate was worthless, condemned and barely worth the dirt it sat on. But when Margot and Thaddeus opened a wall they weren't supposed to touch, they found $285 million in art, gold, and secrets that powerful people had been hunting for 30 years. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Margot Adelaide Finch had spent 43 years teaching high school literature in a town so small it didn't even have a traffic light. Her husband, Thaddeus, taught mathematics in the classroom next door. Together they'd raised 2 children, paid off a modest mortgage, and saved every spare dollar in a coffee tin beneath the kitchen sink. They weren't rich, they weren't even comfortable, but they'd built something steady, something honest. And now, at 72 and 74, they were supposed to be enjoying retirement. Except retirement didn't pay the bills. Thaddeus's pension had been cut twice. Margot's savings account earned 3 cents a month in interest. Medical bills piled up like autumn leaves, and the duplex they rented, the one with the leaking roof and the landlord who never answered calls, had just raised the rent by $200. So when Margot saw the estate listing pinned to the bulletin board at the post office, she stopped cold. Foreclosure auction, historic property, sold as is, starting bid $5,000. The photo showed a sprawling mansion, 3 stories tall, wrapped in ivy and shadows. Columns sagged, windows were boarded. The fountain in the courtyard had cracked down the middle, spilling nothing but weeds. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Margot tore the flyer down and folded it into her purse. That evening, she spread it across the kitchen table. Thaddeus adjusted his reading glasses and squinted at the fine print. Says here the bank won't even insure it. Structural damage, possible mold. Estimated repair costs exceed value. Margot tapped the photo with her finger. But look at the bones. Look at those arches. That stonework. Someone built that to last. Thaddeus shook his head slowly. Margot, we don't have money to gamble. We don't have money to keep renting either, she said quietly. This place costs us $1,400 a month. If we could buy that estate outright, fix it up, maybe flip it, we'd have something, a cushion, a future. Thaddeus stared at her for a long time. Then he sighed. You've always been braver than me. The auction was held on a grey morning in late October, inside the county courthouse. Only 6 people showed up. A real estate developer in a suit that cost more than Margot's car. 2 young men with cameras who looked like they ran a YouTube channel. A woman with a clipboard who worked for the Historical Society. And Margot and Thaddeus, sitting in the back row, hands clasped like they were praying. The auctioneer was bored. He rattled off the details in a monotone. Lot 47, the Belmont Estate, 18,000 square feet, 4.2 acres, condemned by county inspectors, sold as is, no warranties, no guarantees. Opening bid, $5,000. Silence. The developer smirked. The YouTubers whispered. The Historical Society woman scribbled notes. 5,000, Margot said, her voice clear and steady. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked. We have 5,000. Do I hear 6? Nothing. Going once, going twice. The developer leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Sold for $5,000 to bidder 23. Margot's hand trembled as she signed the paperwork. Thaddeus pulled their life savings from an envelope, $8,500 bills held together with a rubber band. The clerk counted it twice. When they walked out of that courthouse, they owned a mansion. A broken, forgotten, possibly cursed mansion. But it was theirs. The town reacted exactly how Margot expected. At the grocery store, the cashier gave her a pitying look. Heard you bought the Belmont place. That's real brave of you. At the diner, old men shook their heads over coffee. That house has been rotting for 30 years. Ain't nobody been inside since Vance Belmont died. At the library, the clerk whispered, My aunt used to clean for him. Said he was paranoid. Had locks on every door. Wouldn't let anyone pass the foyer. Margot smiled politely and ignored them all. She'd spent her entire life being underestimated. One more time wouldn't kill her. The estate sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, hidden behind iron gates that had rusted open decades ago. Oak trees lined the path, their branches twisted and gnarled like arthritic fingers. The air smelled of wet leaves and something older, something that had been waiting. When the mansion came into view, Margot's breath caught. It was massive. 3 stories of pale stone, covered in ivy that climbed like veins. The roof had caved in on the east wing. The grand staircase leading to the front door had cracked down the middle, but the columns still stood. The windows, though boarded, were framed in hand-carved limestone, and above the door, barely visible beneath the grime, was a coat of arms, a phoenix rising from ashes. Thaddeus parked the truck and stepped out slowly. "It's bigger than I thought." Margot opened her door and stood in the overgrown grass. "It's perfect." They spent the first day just walking the perimeter. The estate was even larger than the listing suggested. Behind the main house, there was a carriage house, a greenhouse with shattered glass, and a stone well that looked like it hadn't been used since the Civil War. The gardens were a jungle now, rose bushes gone feral, hedges swallowing statues. But underneath the chaos, Margot could see the design. Someone had loved this place once. Someone had poured their soul into every detail. Thaddeus found the main entrance unlocked. The door groaned open, releasing a breath of stale air. Inside, the foyer was cathedral high. A chandelier, massive and draped in cobwebs, hung from chains thick as a man's wrist. The floor was marble, cracked but still gleaming faintly beneath the dust. To the left, a grand staircase spiraled upward. To the right, double doors opened into what must have been a ballroom. Margot stepped inside carefully, her boots echoing. "Hello?" Her voice bounced off the walls and came back hollow. Thaddeus walked to the center of the foyer and looked up. "I don't think anyone's been here in a very long time." They explored slowly, room by room. The dining hall had a table long enough to seat 20, still set with tarnished silverware. The library had floor-to-ceiling shelves, books swollen with moisture and time. The kitchen was a museum piece, cast-iron stove, ceramic sink, cupboards stocked with jars so old the labels had faded to nothing. Upstairs, the bedrooms were smaller but still grand, 4-poster beds with rotted canopies, wardrobes filled with moth-eaten clothes. One room had a child's rocking horse in the corner, covered in dust. Margot touched it gently, and it creaked, rocking once before going still. "Someone lived here," she whispered. "Someone had a whole life here." Thaddeus stood in the doorway. And then they didn't. By the 3rd day, they'd moved in. Not into the main house, it wasn't safe yet, but into the carriage house, which had a working wood stove and a roof that didn't leak. Margot set up a cot, a folding table, and a hot plate. Thaddeus brought in boxes of their belongings, the things they'd packed from the duplex, clothes, books, photo albums, Margot's teaching certificates framed in cheap plastic. It wasn't much, but it was a start. At night, they sat by the wood stove and made lists. What needed fixing? What could be salvaged? What would cost too much? The list grew longer every hour. "We're going to need help," Thaddeus said. Margot nodded. "We'll figure it out. We always do." The next morning, Margot began documenting everything. She'd brought a digital camera, a cheap one from the pharmacy, and she took photos of every room, every corner, every crack. She wanted a record, proof of what they'd started with, proof of what they'd built. In the library, she found something strange. On one of the shelves, a row of books sat perfectly aligned, spines flush, no dust. She ran her finger along them. They'd been touched recently, or preserved somehow. She pulled one out, a first edition of Wuthering Heights. She opened it carefully. Inside the front cover, a name was written in fading ink: Vance Belmont, 1968. Margot's heart quickened. She pulled another book. Same name, different year. Another. The entire shelf was a timeline. Vance Belmont had collected these books over decades, and someone, maybe Vance himself, had kept them pristine. She called Thaddeus over. "Look at this." He adjusted his glasses and studied the shelf. "These are worth something." "Maybe," Margot said. "But why are they in perfect condition when everything else is falling apart?" Thaddeus frowned. "Preservation, climate control, or someone's been coming here." Margot's skin prickled. "Who?" "I don't know," he said, "but we should be careful." That afternoon, they searched for more information. In the dining room, Margot found a stack of old newspapers beneath a corner table, yellowed and brittle. She spread them out carefully. The headlines told a story. Local art dealer amasses fortune. Belmont Estate hosts international collectors. Vance Belmont, recluse or visionary. And then, 27 years ago, Belmont found dead, no heirs, estate abandoned. Margot read the article aloud. Vance Belmont, 73, was discovered deceased in his study. Cause of death, heart failure. He had no living relatives, no will was ever found. The estate passed into probate, then into the hands of the bank. And there it sat, forgotten. Thaddeus leaned against the table. So he died alone. "Seems like it," Margot said, "but he was protecting something. I can feel it." Over the next week, they worked tirelessly. Thaddeus patched holes in the carriage house roof. Margot cleared debris from the main hallways. Slowly, the estate began to breathe again. But the more they uncovered, the stranger things became. In the ballroom, the floor was rotted through in some places, but perfectly intact in others. In the study, the walls were lined with empty frames, as if paintings had been removed in a hurry. In the kitchen, the pantry door was newer than the rest of the house, installed maybe 10 or 15 years ago. "Why would someone remodel a pantry in an abandoned house?" Margot asked. Thaddeus had no answer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, Margot stood in the main foyer and just listened. The house had sounds, creaks and groans, yes, but also something else, a rhythm, like breathing. She walked to the far wall, the one beneath the staircase, and pressed her palm against it. It was warm, not hot, but warmer than the rest of the house. She knocked. The sound came back hollow. "Thaddeus," she called. He appeared at the top of the stairs. "What is it?" "This wall. It doesn't sound right." He came down slowly, knees aching, and knocked in several places. "You're right. There's a gap. A space." Margot ran her hands along the edges, looking for seams, for anything. And then she found it, hidden beneath layers of old wallpaper, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. A thin groove, a line. Thaddeus pulled out his pocket knife and carefully peeled back the wallpaper. Underneath was wood paneling, and in the center of the panel, almost invisible, was a small brass keyhole. They stared at it. "That's not original," Thaddeus whispered. "No," Margot agreed. "That was added later. By Vance. Has to be." They searched the house for a key. They tore through drawers, closets, cabinets. They checked under floorboards and behind loose bricks. Nothing. By midnight, they sat exhausted on the foyer floor, backs against the wall. "Maybe it's not here," Thaddeus said. Margot closed her eyes. "Or maybe it's hidden the same way the lock is." She stood up, body aching, and walked back to the library. She scanned the shelves, the books, the perfect preservation. And then she saw it. One book sat slightly crooked, just a fraction of an inch out of line. She pulled it. Behind it, taped to the back of the shelf, was a small brass key. Her hands shook as she held it up to the light. "Thaddeus." He appeared in the doorway. When he saw the key, his face went pale. "Are we really doing this?" Margot looked at him, this man she'd spent 50 years beside, this man who'd graded calculus tests and paid bills, and never once asked for more than what life gave him. "We've come this far," she said. "I think we have to." They returned to the hidden keyhole beneath the staircase. Margot slid the key in. It fit perfectly. She turned it slowly. Something deep in the wall clicked. Then a hum, mechanical and low, like gears waking after a long sleep. The panel shifted. Dust fell from the edges. And then, with a soft hiss, the wall slid inward, revealing darkness beyond. Thaddeus grabbed the flashlight from his tool belt. The beam cut through the black, illuminating a narrow passageway, stone walls, a descending staircase. Cool air rushed out, dry and preserved. Margot stepped forward. "Wait!" Thaddeus grabbed her arm. "We don't know what's down there." "No," she said, "but we're about to find out." She took the flashlight from his hand and stepped into the passage. Thaddeus hesitated, then followed. The passage was narrow, built for secrecy, not comfort. The stairs descended steeply, maybe 20 feet down. The air grew colder. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small room. Margot swept the flashlight across the space and froze. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves, paintings, small ones, wrapped in protective cloth. She unwrapped one carefully. It was a landscape, vibrant, signed in the corner. She didn't recognize the name, but the style was unmistakable. Oil, old, valuable. Thaddeus unwrapped another, a portrait, then another, a still life. "These are real," he whispered. "These are actual paintings." Margot's heart pounded. Why would Vance hide these? "Because," Thaddeus said slowly, "someone was looking for them." They found more. In wooden crates stacked neatly in the corner. Sculptures, small bronze pieces, jade carvings. In a locked cabinet, which Thaddeus pried open with a crowbar, documents, yellowed and brittle, written in languages Margot didn't recognize. Provenance papers, authenticity certificates, letters from galleries in Paris, Rome, Buenos Aires. And at the very back of the room, behind a stack of crates, they found a safe. It was old, industrial, the kind banks used in the 1930s. The combination lock was rusted but intact. "We need to open this," Margot said. "How?" Thaddeus asked. "We don't have the combination." Margot smiled faintly. "Then we'll find it." They spent the rest of the night searching the hidden room. They found more paintings, more documents, and finally, tucked inside a leather journal, a slip of paper. On it, written in Vance's careful handwriting, 32, 14, 7, 41. Margot's hands shook as she spun the dial. 32, click, 14, click, 7, click, 41. The safe groaned. The lock disengaged. She pulled the heavy door open. Inside, stacks of papers, bonds, certificates, and a letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Margot unfolded it with trembling fingers and read aloud. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have done what no one else could. You have found what I spent my life protecting. These pieces are not stolen. They are rescued from war, from greed, from men who would destroy beauty for profit. I purchased them legally. I saved them. And I hid them because the world was not ready to understand. I have no family, no heirs, but I believe that whoever finds this room, whoever has the courage to look, deserves to decide what comes next. Do not let them be lost again." Vance Belmont, April 5, 1994. Margot's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Thaddeus, who stood silent, flashlight hanging loose in his hand. "He was protecting them," she whispered. "All of this. He wasn't hoarding. He was saving." Thaddeus swallowed hard. "How much do you think this is worth?" Margot looked around the room, at the paintings, the sculptures, the documents, the bonds. She thought of the shelves above, the books, the careful preservation. She thought of Vance alone in this house, carrying the weight of the world's beauty on his shoulders. "I don't know," she said, "but I think it's more than we can imagine." They climbed back up the stairs, closed the hidden door, and sat in the foyer as dawn broke through the boarded windows. Neither of them spoke. They just sat side by side, holding hands, as the enormity of what they'd found settled over them like dust. The bank had declared this place worthless. The town had called them fools. But Margot and Thaddeus, two retired teachers with nothing but hope and a willingness to look, had just uncovered a secret that could change everything. And somewhere, in the walls of that crumbling estate, Vance Belmont's legacy waited, patient and preserved, for someone brave enough to protect it again. Margot didn't sleep. How could she? The weight of what lay beneath their feet pressed against her chest like a stone. She sat at the folding table in the carriage house, surrounded by the documents they'd brought up from the hidden room, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. Thaddeus had finally dozed off on the cot around 4 a.m, his snoring soft and rhythmic. But Margot's mind raced. She studied the provenance papers, the letters, the certificates of authenticity. Each piece told a story. A painting rescued from a collapsing regime in Eastern Europe, a sculpture smuggled out of a country on the brink of civil war, bonds purchased legally but hidden because they represented wealth that dangerous people wanted. Vance Belmont hadn't been a thief, he'd been a guardian. By sunrise, Margot had made a list. She needed answers, real answers, and that meant digging deeper into Vance's life, into the architecture of the house, into the secrets still buried in the walls. She needed blueprints. She needed history. She needed to understand what else might be hidden. Thaddeus woke to the smell of instant coffee and found Margot already dressed, her jacket zipped, keys in hand. "Where are you going?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "County Records Office," she said. "If Vance built hidden rooms, there have to be permits, blueprints, something." Thaddeus sat up slowly. "You think they'll just hand those over?" "I'm a sweet old lady," Margot said with a half-smile. "People underestimate sweet old ladies," he chuckled. "That they do." The County Records Office was a squat brick building with fluorescent lights that hummed like dying bees. Margot walked up to the desk, where a young woman with purple hair and a nose ring sat scrolling through her phone. "Excuse me," Margot said politely. "I'm looking for building permits and blueprints for the Belmont estate." The woman looked up, unimpressed. "Property address?" Margot recited it from memory. The woman typed slowly, then frowned. "That place? It's been condemned?" "I own it," Margot said. "Just bought it at auction." The woman's expression shifted. "Oh, okay. Let me see what we have." She disappeared into a back room. Margot waited, hands folded, heart pounding. 10 minutes later, the woman returned with a cardboard box, dusty and taped shut. "This is everything we have. Original blueprints from 1928, renovation permits from 1963 and 1977, some correspondence. You can look through it here, but you can't take it out of the building." "Can I make copies?" Margot asked. The woman shrugged. 10 cents a page." Margot spent the next 3 hours hunched over a table, carefully unfolding brittle yellowed blueprints. The original design from 1928 was stunning. The architect, a man named Aldous Crane, had designed the estate with meticulous detail. Grand staircases, ballrooms, libraries, servant quarters, wine cellars. But when Margot compared the original plans to the renovation permits from the 60s and 70s, something didn't match. Entire sections of the house had been redrawn. Walls moved, rooms sealed, new passages added, and the permits were all signed by Vance Belmont himself. He'd hired private contractors, no inspections, no public record of what was actually built. Margot's pulse quickened. Vance hadn't just hidden a room. He'd redesigned the entire estate into a labyrinth. She made copies of everything, feeding coins into the machine until her purse was empty. When she returned to the estate, Thaddeus was in the main house, measuring the walls of the foyer with a tape measure. "Find anything?" he asked. Margot spread the blueprints across the dusty dining table. "Look at this. The original design shows the wine cellar here, beneath the kitchen. But in 1977, Vance submitted a permit to renovate and expand storage facilities. He sealed off half the original cellar and built new walls. Thaddeus leaned over the blueprints, comparing them to the current layout. "So there's more down there." "A lot more," Margot said. "And I think the hidden room we found is just the beginning." They spent the rest of the day searching. They moved through the house methodically, tapping walls, measuring rooms, comparing everything to the blueprints. And Margot had been right. The house was full of inconsistencies. In the library, the east wall was 3 feet thicker than the west. In the study, the fireplace had been bricked over, but the chimney still vented somewhere. In the second-floor hallway, a door that should have led to a bedroom, according to the original blueprints, instead opened to a linen closet, barely 4 feet deep. "He rebuilt this place into a fortress," Thaddeus muttered. "Or a vault," Margot said. That evening, a truck rumbled up the gravel driveway. Margot looked out the window and saw a man in his 60s climbing out, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He had a weathered face, wire-rimmed glasses, and the cautious posture of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. Margot stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" The man stopped at the bottom of the steps. "My name's Leonard Wade. I'm a local historian. I heard you bought this place." Margot nodded. "We did." Leonard looked up at the mansion, his expression unreadable. "I knew Vance Belmont. Not well, but I knew him. And I've been studying this house for 20 years. Margot's guard went up. "Why?" "Because," Leonard said carefully, "I believe he was protecting something, and I think you've already found it." Margot and Thaddeus exchanged a glance. Leonard saw it. "I'm not here to take anything," he said quickly. "I just want to know the truth. Vance was my friend once. He helped me when no one else would. And when he died, I tried to get access to the estate, but the bank shut me out. I've been waiting for someone to buy this place, someone who'd actually look." Margot considered him for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in." They sat in the library, the 3 of them, surrounded by Vance's books. Leonard pulled a worn journal from his satchel. "Vance gave this to me in 1992. He said if anything happened to him, I should try to make sure his work wasn't lost, but I never understood what he meant until after he died." He opened the journal. Inside were sketches, notes, maps. Vance wasn't just an art dealer, he was a protector. During the Balkan conflicts, during political upheavals in South America, during regime changes in Africa, he used his connections to rescue art, artifacts, documents, things that would have been destroyed or sold to the highest bidder. He brought them here. Thaddeus leaned forward. How did he afford all this? Leonard smiled faintly. Vance was wealthy, family money. But more than that, he was smart. He invested in art when it was cheap, sold when it was valuable, and used the profit to save more. He wasn't hoarding, he was preserving. Margot's throat tightened. Why didn't he tell anyone? "Because," Leonard said, "he didn't trust anyone. And he had good reason. There were people, collectors, governments, criminals who wanted what he had. He got threats, break-ins. Once, someone tried to burn the estate down, so he went underground, literally." Margot showed Leonard the hidden room. His hands shook as he unwrapped the paintings, as he read the documents. Tears filled his eyes. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew he'd done it." "Done what?" Thaddeus asked. "Saved them," Leonard said. "All of them." He looked at Margot and Thaddeus. "Do you understand what you have here? This isn't just valuable. This is history, pieces that were thought lost forever, and Vance kept them safe." Margot felt the weight of it settle deeper. "What do we do?" Leonard shook his head. "That's not for me to say. But I'll tell you this. There are people who've been looking for this collection for decades, and once word gets out that you found it, they'll come. What happens next will turn this quiet estate into a battleground, reveal the true scale of Vance's mission, and force Margot and Thaddeus to decide whether they're ready to fight for a legacy that isn't even theirs. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Leonard left just after dark, promising to return with more information. Margot and Thaddeus stood on the porch and watched his taillights disappear down the driveway. "Do you believe him?" Thaddeus asked. "Yes," Margot said, "but that doesn't mean I trust him." They went back inside. The house felt different now, heavier. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every creak sounded like a warning. Margot couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Over the next few days, they continued their search. They found more hidden spaces. Behind a bookshelf in the study, a compartment filled with journals. Vance's handwriting covered every page. Dates, names, transactions, locations. He'd documented everything. In the servants' quarters, they found a narrow staircase that led down to a storage room filled with crates. Inside the crates, more paintings, more sculptures, more pieces of history carefully wrapped and preserved. In the attic, behind a false wall, they found maps, hand-drawn maps of the estate, marked with X's and notes. One map showed the wine cellar, and in the corner, in red ink, Vance had written, "Final vault, do not open unless absolutely necessary." Margot showed it to Thaddeus. "The wine cellar, there's more down there." Thaddeus studied the map. He didn't want anyone to find it. "No," Margot agreed, "but we're going to." They descended into the basement. The air was cold and damp, smelling of earth and old stone. The wine cellar was large, lined with empty racks that had once held bottles. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like curtains. At the far end, behind a row of broken shelves, they found what the map had indicated, a brick wall, newer than the rest, mortar still pale. Thaddeus knocked on it. Solid. This was built recently, maybe 25 years ago. Margot ran her hand along the edges. He sealed something inside. "Should we open it?" Thaddeus asked. Margot looked at him. She saw the doubt in his eyes, the fear. They'd already found so much. Maybe it was enough. Maybe they should stop. But something in her refused. "Yes," she said, "we have to know." They went back to the carriage house and gathered tools, sledgehammers, crowbars, chisels. Margot changed into old jeans and a sweatshirt. Thaddeus wrapped his hands with cloth to protect against blisters. They returned to the wine cellar as the sun set. The light from their work lamps cast long shadows across the brick. Thaddeus raised the sledgehammer. Last chance to walk away. Margot picked up a crowbar. "I've never walked away from anything in my life. I'm not starting now," he smiled. Then he swung. The hammer connected with the brick. A crack spider-webbed across the surface. He swung again. Chunks of mortar fell. Again. Margot used the crowbar to pry loose bricks free. They clattered to the floor. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. They worked in silence, the only sounds their breathing and the crash of metal on stone. After an hour, they'd made a hole large enough to see through. Margot shined her flashlight inside. Her breath caught. "Thaddeus." He stopped, chest heaving. "What is it?" "It's huge," she whispered. "It's a whole other room." They worked faster now, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. They pulled away brick after brick until the opening was large enough to crawl through. Margot went first. She squeezed through the gap, flashlight in one hand, and dropped down onto a concrete floor. The room was massive, easily 40 feet long, 20 feet wide. The walls were lined with metal shelves, floor to ceiling, and on those shelves, everything. Paintings in climate-controlled cases, sculptures on pedestals, display cases filled with jewelry, coins, manuscripts, filing cabinets labeled by country and year, a workstation with restoration tools, still organized, still ready. and in the center of the room, a large table covered in documents. Thaddeus climbed through after her. When he saw it, he couldn't speak. Margot walked slowly down the rows, her flashlight revealing treasure after treasure. A Vermeer, a Caravaggio, a small bronze by Rodin, jade artifacts from ancient China, illuminated manuscripts from medieval Europe, gold bars stacked neatly in a corner, each one stamped with official seals. She stopped at the table and picked up a leather binder. Inside, an inventory. Every single item catalogued, provenance documented, current estimated value listed. She flipped to the last page. Total estimated value, $285 million. Her knees buckled. Thaddeus caught her. "What does it say?" She handed him the binder with shaking hands. He read, and then he sat down hard on the concrete floor. They stayed like that for a long time, just sitting in the middle of $285 million, too stunned to move. Finally, Margot spoke. "He spent his whole life building this." "And hid it," Thaddeus said. "Why?" Margot looked around the room. "Because he knew what would happen if anyone found out. People would fight over it. Governments would claim it. Collectors would tear it apart. So he buried it, and he died with the secret." Thaddeus rubbed his face. "What do we do now?" Before Margot could answer, they heard something. Footsteps. Above them, in the wine cellar. Someone else was in the house. Margot turned off her flashlight. Thaddeus did the same. They sat in perfect darkness, hearts pounding. The footsteps moved closer, stopped at the broken brick wall. A voice, male, calm. "I know you're down there." Margot didn't move. "I'm not here to hurt you," the voice continued. "I'm from the bank. We need to talk." Margot climbed back through the hole, Thaddeus right behind her. A man stood in the wine cellar, wearing a suit that was too expensive for a small-town banker. He was in his 40s, clean-shaven, with eyes that didn't match his smile. "Mrs. Finch, Mr. Finch, my name is Raymond Cole. I'm with Capital Region Trust. We held the mortgage on this property." Margot crossed her arms. "We bought it legally. The deed is filed." "Oh, I know," Raymond said smoothly. "And congratulations. You got quite a deal. But there are some concerns. The bank has received inquiries about the estate, potential historical violations, zoning issues. We'd like to offer you a buyout, double what you paid, $18,000, cash, today." "No," Margot said immediately. Raymond's smile tightened. "Mrs. Finch, I don't think you understand. This property has significant liabilities, structural damage, environmental hazards. You could be liable for millions in repairs. We're trying to help you." "We're not selling," Thaddeus said, stepping beside his wife. Raymond looked at them both for a long moment. Then his expression changed. The friendly mask slipped. "People have been looking for what's in this house for a very long time. You're in over your heads. Take the money. Walk away." "Or what?" Margot asked. Raymond didn't answer. He just turned and walked up the stairs. They heard the front door close, then an engine starting, tires on gravel. Margot and Thaddeus stood in the silence. "He knows," Thaddeus whispered. "Of course he knows," Margot said. "The bank's probably known for years. They just couldn't get access. Until we bought it." "So what do we do?" Margot looked at the hole in the brick wall, at the treasure beyond. "We document everything. We take photos. We make copies of every single document, and we find someone we can trust." "Who?" Thaddeus asked. Margot thought of Leonard Wade, the historian who'd known Vance. Someone who cares about the truth more than the money. They spent the entire night in the vault. Margot photographed everything with the digital camera, careful and methodical. Thaddeus copied documents on a portable scanner they'd brought from the carriage house. They worked until their backs ached and their eyes burned. By dawn, they had proof. Thousands of photos, hundreds of scanned documents, and one clear truth. Vance Belmont had assembled one of the most significant private art collections in history. And he'd done it legally, ethically, and alone. Margot climbed the stairs into the pale morning light. She stood in the foyer and looked around. This house had been called worthless, condemned, forgotten. But beneath its crumbling facade, it held something priceless, and now it was theirs. The question was, what were they going to do with it? Thaddeus came up behind her. "We could walk away, take the bank's offer, live quietly." Margot shook her head. "Vance didn't spend 50 years protecting this just so we could hand it back to the people who wanted to bury it." "Then what?" he asked. She turned to face him. "Then we finish what he started. We protect it, we share it, we make sure the world knows what he did." Thaddeus smiled, tired and proud. "You've always been braver than me." Over the next week, strange things began to happen. A black sedan appeared at the end of the driveway twice, just sitting there, watching. Their mail was opened and resealed. The phone in the carriage house rang at odd hours, no one on the other end. Someone tried to access the property at night. Thaddeus chased them off with a flashlight and a baseball bat. Margot started sleeping with a tire iron beside the cot. They were being watched, pressured, and it was only going to get worse. Leonard Wade returned, this time with a colleague, a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, an art historian from the State University. She had kind eyes and steady hands. "Leonard told me what you found," she said. "I need to see it." Margot led her down to the vault. Dr. Voss didn't speak for a full 10 minutes. She just walked the rows, examining pieces, reading labels, her expression shifting from disbelief to awe to something close to reverence. Finally, she turned to Margot. "This is extraordinary. Do you understand what you have here?" "I'm starting to," Margot said. "This collection belongs in museums," Dr. Voss said. "But more than that, it belongs to history. Vance saved these pieces from destruction, and now you have the chance to finish his work." "How?" Thaddeus asked. Dr. Voss pulled out a notebook. "We authenticate everything. We contact the proper authorities, we establish legal ownership, and we make sure that no one, not the bank, not private collectors, not anyone can take this away from you." "Will that work?" Margot asked. Dr. Voss met her eyes. "If we're careful, and if we move fast." They began the process. Dr. Voss brought in a team, conservators, appraisers, lawyers who specialized in art recovery. Every piece was photographed, catalogued, authenticated. The paperwork Vance had kept proved invaluable. Every item had been purchased legally, every transaction documented. There was no fraud, no theft, just one man's lifetime of careful, quiet preservation. But the pressure mounted. The bank sent more letters. Offers increased, then threats of legal action. Someone broke into the carriage house while they were in town. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear: "We can get to you." Margot refused to be intimidated. She'd spent 43 years standing in front of teenagers who thought they could outlast her. She could outlast anyone. One night, Thaddeus found her sitting on the grand staircase, staring up at the chandelier. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Just thinking about Vance, how lonely he must have been, carrying all this by himself." Thaddeus sat beside her. "He's not alone anymore." Margot leaned her head on his shoulder. "No, I guess he's not." The final piece of the puzzle came from Vance's journals. Margot had been reading them every night, trying to understand the man who'd built this empire of beauty. In one entry, dated March 19, 1993, he wrote, "When the world burns, beauty must be buried. But burial is not the end. It is the waiting. Someone will come. Someone who sees what others overlook. Someone who understands that value is not measured in dollars, but in what we choose to protect. When they come, the walls will open, the truth will rise, and perhaps, finally, I will rest." Margot closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. "We're that someone," she whispered. Thaddeus squeezed her hand. "Then let's make him proud." By the end of the month, they had a plan. The collection would be authenticated and documented. Portions would be donated to museums. Some pieces would be returned to their countries of origin, if those countries could prove rightful claim. The estate itself would become a cultural center, a testament to Vance's mission. And Margot and Thaddeus would be its guardians. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about finishing something that mattered. It was about proving that even two ordinary people, armed with nothing but courage and a willingness to look, could change the world. The walls of the Belmont estate had kept secrets for decades, but now those walls were about to speak. The authentication process began on a cold Monday morning in early November. Dr. Patricia Voss arrived with a team of 5 specialists, 2 art conservators, a documents expert, a forensic authenticator, and a lawyer named Judith Crane, who specialized in art recovery and cultural heritage law. They set up a makeshift laboratory in the ballroom, covering the rotted floor with tarps and plastic sheeting, lights on tripods, cameras, microscopes, testing equipment that looked like it belonged in a hospital. Margot watched them work with a mixture of fascination and fear. These people would determine not just the value of what she'd found, but whether she had any legal right to keep it. Judith Crane was a tall woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair pulled back in a tight bun. She carried herself like someone who'd fought in courtrooms and won. She sat Margot and Thaddeus down at the dining table that first afternoon. "I need you to understand what we're dealing with," she said, spreading out papers. "This collection, if it's authentic and legally obtained, is worth an enormous amount. But that also means enormous liability. Governments could claim pieces. Descendants of original owners could file suits. The IRS will want their share. And there are people, collectors, dealers, criminals, who will do anything to acquire what you have." Margot's jaw tightened. "We're not selling to criminals." "I know," Judith said, "but you need protection, legal protection, and you need it before word spreads." "Word's already spreading," Thaddeus said. "The bank knows. They've been threatening us." Judith nodded. "Then we move quickly. I'll file paperwork establishing you as the legal custodians of the estate and its contents. We'll claim inheritance through purchase. But here's the reality. If anyone challenges this, it could take years to resolve. And during that time, you'll be targets." Margot looked at Thaddeus. His face was pale, tired but determined. She turned back to Judith. "Do whatever you need to do. We're not giving up." The team worked 12-hour days. Each piece was removed from the vault carefully, brought upstairs, examined under lights and microscopes. Paint samples were taken, canvas fibers analyzed, signatures verified against known databases. The conservators worked with gloved hands and infinite patience, peeling back centuries to reveal the truth. Margot learned more about art in those 2 weeks than she had in her entire life. She learned that a single brushstroke could authenticate a masterpiece, that the type of wood used in a frame could date a painting within a decade, that provenance, the documented history of a piece, was sometimes more valuable than the piece itself. And Vance had documented everything. Every painting had a file, every sculpture had a story. He'd kept receipts, letters from galleries, certificates from governments thanking him for preserving cultural artifacts. He'd been meticulous, obsessive, and completely legitimate. Dr. Voss emerged from the vault one afternoon holding a small painting, maybe 12 inches by 16 inches. Her hands shook. "This is a Vermeer," she whispered. "Girl with a water pitcher. It was reported destroyed in a fire in Vienna in 1944. But it wasn't. Vance bought it from a family fleeing the Nazis, legally, and he's kept it safe for 80 years. Margot stared at the painting. A young woman in blue and yellow pouring water, frozen in a moment of quiet grace. "How much is it worth?" Dr. Voss set it down carefully. 30 million, maybe more, but its value isn't just monetary. This is a piece of human heritage that the world thought was lost. And there are dozens more like it, Margot said softly. Dr. Voss nodded, which is why you need to be very, very careful. That night, Margot couldn't sleep. She walked through the estate alone, flashlight in hand, thinking about Vance. He'd lived here for decades, surrounded by beauty, and yet completely isolated. No wife, no children, no friends except for Leonard Wade and maybe a handful of others. His entire life had been dedicated to preserving things that didn't belong to him, that he could never truly own, that he'd hidden away where no one could see them. It was noble, and it was heartbreaking. She found herself in his study, sitting in his chair, surrounded by his books. On the desk was a photo she hadn't noticed before, Vance as a young man, maybe 30, standing beside an older couple. His parents, she assumed. They looked stern, wealthy, formal. Vance looked trapped. Margot picked up the photo and studied his face. Even then, there was something sad in his eyes, like he knew the weight he'd carry. The phone in the carriage house rang at 2 a.m. Thaddeus answered, groggy and confused. "Hello?" A voice, distorted, mechanical. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Walk away while you still can." The line went dead. Thaddeus told Margot in the morning. She reported it to Judith, who reported it to the police. The sheriff came out, took notes, but was clearly out of his depth. "You folks are stirring up something big," he said. "I'd be careful if I were you." "We're being as careful as we can," Margot said. The sheriff left, and she watched his cruiser disappear down the driveway. "We need security," Thaddeus said. Margot agreed. They hired 2 men, retired military, to patrol the property at night. It cost money they didn't have, but Judith advanced them funds from a legal defense account she'd set up. The guards started that evening, and for the first time in weeks, Margot slept through the night. By the end of the second week, the team had authenticated 47 pieces. Every single one was real. Every single one had been legally obtained. The total value so far, $116 million. And they were only halfway through the collection. Dr. Voss held a meeting in the ballroom. The entire team gathered, along with Margot, Thaddeus, Leonard, and Judith. "We need to talk about what happens next," Dr. Voss said. "This collection is beyond anything I've ever seen in private hands. It rivals some national museums. But it also presents a problem. How do we protect it? How do we share it with the world without putting you in danger?" Leonard spoke up. "Vance wanted it protected. That was his mission. Maybe we honor that by keeping it here, making this estate a museum." "That requires funding," Judith said. "Insurance, security, staff. We're talking millions of dollars." "We could sell pieces," one of the conservators suggested. Margot shook her head immediately. "No, Vance didn't want this sold off. He wanted it preserved as a whole." "Then we need donors," Judith said. "Foundations, government grants. But that takes time." "How much time?" Thaddeus asked. "Months, maybe a year." Margot looked around the room. "We don't have a year. Whoever's threatening us won't wait that long." The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 days later, a woman arrived at the estate. She was in her 70s, elegantly dressed, with silver hair and sharp green eyes. She introduced herself as Vivian Belmont. "I'm Vance's cousin," she said, "his only living relative." Margot's guard went up immediately. "We were told he had no heirs." Vivian smiled sadly. "Vance and I weren't close. Our families had a falling out decades ago, but I knew what he was doing. He sent me letters, and when I heard someone had finally bought this place, I had to come." She looked around the foyer, tears forming. "I haven't been here since I was a little girl." Margot and Thaddeus exchanged glances. Judith pulled Margot aside. "Be careful. If she's really family, she could contest your ownership." But there was something about Vivian that felt genuine. Margot invited her in. They sat in the library, and Vivienne told them her story. Vance and I grew up together. Our families were wealthy, old money, but they fought constantly over inheritance, over business, over everything. Vance hated it. He hated the greed. When his parents died, he inherited everything, and he decided to use it differently. He started collecting art, not for profit, but for preservation. And when he saw what was happening around the world, wars, revolutions, cultural destruction, he couldn't stand it. So he started saving pieces, one at a time. She pulled a letter from her purse, yellowed and brittle. He sent me this in 1987. Read it. Margot took the letter carefully. It was written in Vance's handwriting. Dear Vivian, I know we haven't spoken in years. Our families made sure of that. But I want you to know what I've been doing with the money they fought so hard to control. I've been saving beauty, pieces of human history that would otherwise be lost. I've spent everything on this, and I've never been happier. If something happens to me, if this work is ever discovered, I hope whoever finds it understands. This isn't about wealth. It's about what we owe to the future. With love, Vance. Margot's throat tightened. She handed the letter back. Why are you here? Vivian folded the letter carefully. Because I want to help. Vance left me out of his will, probably because he knew our family would fight over it. But he sent me these letters for a reason. He wanted someone to know, someone to understand. And now that you've found his life's work, I want to make sure it's protected. She reached into her bag and pulled out a checkbook. I'm wealthy. Not as wealthy as Vance was, but enough. I want to establish a foundation, the Belmont Preservation Trust. It will fund the restoration of this estate, the care of the collection, and the creation of a museum in Vance's name. On one condition, you remain the custodians. This stays in the hands of people who care, not corporations or governments. Margot couldn't speak. Thaddeus wiped his eyes. Judith leaned forward. How much are you offering? Vivian wrote out a check and slid it across the table. $5 million. For starters, she said, and I'll raise more. The foundation changed everything. Within days, Judith had filed paperwork establishing the Belmont Preservation Trust. Vivian's donation allowed them to hire proper security, bring in more experts, and begin planning for the long-term care of the collection. But it also attracted attention. The local news picked up the story. Elderly couple discovers priceless art collection in condemned mansion. Then regional news, then national. Within a week, reporters camped outside the gates. Helicopters flew overhead. Offers poured in from museums, collectors, even foreign governments. Margot refused every interview, but the pressure was relentless. One reporter managed to climb the fence and was caught by security. Another tried to bribe one of the guards for photos. The sheriff had to station a deputy at the entrance full-time. Through it all, Margot and Thaddeus kept working. They brought piece after piece up from the vault, watched as experts verified their authenticity, and slowly, methodically, built an inventory of everything Vance had saved. One afternoon, Margot found a small wooden box tucked in the back of a filing cabinet. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed to Vance from people around the world. She sat on the floor of the vault and read them. Dear Mr. Belmont, thank you for saving my grandfather's painting. It was all we had left of him after the war. Knowing it's safe brings me peace. Vance, the sculpture you rescued from our burning museum now represents hope for our entire country. We are forever grateful. Sir, the manuscript you preserved contains the last written words of our people's history. You gave us back our heritage, letter after letter, story after story. Vance had touched hundreds of lives, saved countless pieces of history, and never asked for recognition. Margot showed the letters to Thaddeus that night. He read them silently, tears streaming down his face. He was a hero, Thaddeus said, and no one knew. We know, Margot said, and now we make sure the world knows. The authentication process concluded in early December. The final count, 173 pieces. Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, artifacts. Total estimated value, $285 million. But more than that, it represented cultures, eras, stories. It was human history, preserved by one man's quiet determination. Dr. Voss held a press conference. Margot and Thaddeus stood beside her, uncomfortable in borrowed formal clothes, as she announced the discovery. The Belmont collection represents one of the most significant private preservation efforts in modern history. Every piece was legally obtained. Every piece was saved from destruction. And thanks to the courage of Margot and Thaddeus Finch, this collection will now be shared with the world. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, but Margot only half heard them. She was thinking of Vance, alone in this house, protecting beauty no one would see. The threats intensified. The day after the press conference, someone threw a brick through the window of the carriage house. A note was tied to it. "You've made a mistake." 2 days later, one of the security guards found a man trying to break into the vault. The police arrested him. He refused to give his name. Judith filed for a restraining order against the bank, which was still trying to claim ownership. They hired a forensic accountant who discovered something disturbing. The bank had known about the collection for years. They'd been paying someone to monitor the estate, waiting for the right moment to seize it. When Margot and Thaddeus bought it legitimately, they'd disrupted decades of planning. They were going to declare it abandoned, claim ownership, and auction off the contents, Judith explained. "You ruined that." "Good," Margot said. The legal battle dragged on through December and into January. The bank filed motion after motion, claiming the sale had been fraudulent, that Margot and Thaddeus had prior knowledge of the collection's existence. Judith demolished every argument. The bank had no proof. Margot and Thaddeus had public records showing they'd been just as surprised as anyone. Finally, in late January, a judge ruled in their favor. The estate and its contents legally belonged to Margot and Thaddeus Finch, under the stewardship of the Belmont Preservation Trust. The bank appealed, but Judith was confident. "We've won," she said. "They're just stalling now." With the legal victory, work began in earnest. Architects drew up plans to restore the estate. Conservators stabilized the most fragile pieces. Vivian secured additional funding from private donors who believed in Vance's mission. And Margot and Thaddeus, exhausted but determined, oversaw it all. One cold February morning, Margot stood in the vault alone. The team had removed most of the pieces for conservation work. The metal shelves stood empty. The room echoed. She thought about the first time she'd climbed through that brick wall, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. How terrified and exhilarated she'd been. How impossible it all seemed. Now it was real, tangible, permanent. She heard footsteps and turned. Thaddeus appeared at the entrance. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About Vance. About how much he sacrificed for this. And about how lucky we are that we were the ones who found it." Thaddeus walked to her and took her hand. "I don't think it was luck. I think he was waiting for someone like us, someone who'd actually care." Spring arrived slowly. The estate began to transform. Contractors repaired the roof, painters restored the exterior, landscapers cleared the overgrown gardens, revealing marble fountains and stone paths. Inside, rooms were stabilized, walls reinforced, floors replaced. The vault was expanded, with state-of-the-art climate control and security. The ballroom was converted into a gallery. The library would house manuscripts. The study would be preserved exactly as Vance had left it, a window into his life. Vivian visited weekly, often bringing potential donors. She'd become the public face of the foundation, telling Vance's story with passion and pride. "He was an eccentric," she'd say, "a recluse, but he had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known." Margot and Thaddeus stayed in the background, which was how they preferred it. They weren't interested in fame. They were interested in finishing what they'd started. One April afternoon, Leonard Wade brought Margot a package. "This arrived at my office. It's addressed to you." Margot opened it carefully. Inside was a leather journal, old and worn. A note was tucked in the front. "Mrs. Finch, my name is Elias Stone. I was Vance Belmont's attorney for 30 years. I only recently learned that his estate had been sold and his collection discovered. I thought you should have this. It's his final journal. He gave it to me a week before he died and told me to hold on to it until the right person came along. I believe that's you." Margot's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The entries were dated from March to April of 1994, just weeks before Vance died. She sat on the porch steps and began to read. March 3rd. "I am 73 years old. My heart is failing. The doctors give me months, maybe weeks. I have no regrets. I have spent my life doing what mattered, protecting beauty, preserving history, saving pieces of humanity that would otherwise be lost. But I am tired, and I am alone. I have no heirs, no one to pass this responsibility to. So I've made a decision. I will seal the vaults. I will hide everything, and I will trust that someday someone will find it. Someone who doesn't see dollar signs but sees purpose. Someone who understands that this collection isn't about wealth. It's about legacy." March 15th. "I've finished the final vault. Everything is secure, climate-controlled, documented, preserved. When I die, the bank will take the estate. They'll think it's worthless. And for years, maybe decades, it will sit empty. But eventually, someone will come. Someone curious. Someone brave. And they'll open the walls." March 27th. "I'm weaker now. I can barely walk. But I'm at peace, because I've done something that matters. I've saved pieces of human beauty from destruction. And someday, when this is all discovered, people will know. They'll know that one man, one ordinary man, chose to spend his life protecting what others overlooked." April 1st. If you're reading this, you've found my life's work, and you've made a choice. The choice to protect it, to share it, to honor what I spent 50 years building. Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to look. Thank you for caring enough to fight. And thank you for finishing what I started. With gratitude and hope, Vance Belmont." Margot closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Thaddeus sat beside her. "What did it say?" She handed him the journal. He read silently. When he finished, he pulled Margot close. "We did it," he whispered. "We finished it." Margot nodded against his shoulder. "Yeah, we did." The museum opened on a warm Saturday in June. Hundreds of people came, locals and tourists, students and scholars. They walked through the restored estate, marveling at the paintings, the sculptures, the artifacts. Each piece had a placard explaining its history, where Vance had found it, why it mattered. In the study, behind glass, Vance's journal sat open to his final entry. People stopped and read it, many wiping their eyes. In the foyer, a bronze plaque had been mounted on the wall. The Belmont Preservation Trust, dedicated to Vance Belmont, who spent his life saving beauty, and to Margot and Thaddeus Finch, who had the courage to share it. Margot and Thaddeus stood on the grand staircase, watching people explore. A young girl, maybe 10, ran up to them. "Did you really find all this hidden behind a wall?" Margot smiled. "We did." The girl's eyes went wide. "That's so cool. I want to find treasure someday too." "Then be brave," Margot said, "and always look for what others miss." The months that followed were a blur. The museum became one of the most visited cultural sites in the region. Schools brought students, universities sent researchers. People traveled from across the country just to see what 2 retired teachers had found beneath a crumbling mansion. Margot and Thaddeus hired staff. They established educational programs. They created scholarships for students studying art history and conservation. And slowly, quietly, they became exactly what Vance had hoped for, guardians of beauty. Vivienne passed away peacefully in her sleep that October. She left her entire estate to the foundation. At her funeral, Margot read a letter Vivienne had written. Vance and I lost so many years to family grudges and pride. But in the end, he taught me what really matters. Not money, not status, but what we choose to protect. I'm grateful I got to help finish his work. And I'm grateful to Margot and Thaddeus for showing us all what courage looks like. One cold November evening, exactly 1 year after they'd first opened the hidden door, Margot and Thaddeus sat alone in the study. The house was quiet. The last tour had ended hours ago. They'd poured 2 glasses of wine, cheap stuff from the grocery store, the only kind they could ever afford. "We did good," Thaddeus said, raising his glass. Margot clinked hers against his. "We did better than good. We changed things." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire crackle in the restored fireplace. "Do you ever regret it?" Thaddeus asked. "Buying this place? All the danger, all the stress?" Margot thought for a moment. "No, not for a second. Do you?" He shook his head. "This was the most important thing I've ever done." Margot squeezed his hand. "Me too." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the estate's stone walls and covering the gardens in white. Inside, beneath those walls, $285 million worth of art and history rested safely. But more than that, a legacy lived on. Vance Belmont's mission, born from loneliness and dedication, had been fulfilled. Not by governments or museums or wealthy collectors, but by 2 ordinary people who saw something others missed, who had the courage to open a door no one else would touch, who understood that some things are worth protecting even when the world says they're worthless. The house that was once condemned now stood as a monument, not to wealth, not to power, but to the quiet belief that beauty matters, that history matters, that one person's choice to preserve rather than profit can change everything. And as Margot and Thaddeus sat by the fire, their hands intertwined, they knew something profound. They hadn't just saved Vance's collection, they'd saved his soul. And in doing so, they'd found their own purpose. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones we seek, they're the ones we're brave enough to protect. The second year of the museum brought challenges nobody anticipated. Insurance costs skyrocketed. Security had to be increased after someone attempted to break in through a second-floor window, and the emotional toll of being responsible for $285 million worth of irreplaceable art began to weigh on Margot and Thaddeus in ways they hadn't expected. Margot woke up most nights around 3 a.m, heart racing, convinced she'd heard glass breaking or alarms going off. She'd pad through the carriage house in her slippers, peer out the window at the main estate, and only relax when she saw the security guards making their rounds. Thaddeus developed tension headaches that lasted for days. The doctor prescribed medication, but what he really needed was peace of mind, something that felt increasingly impossible. They sat in the small office they'd set up in what used to be the butler's pantry, reviewing monthly expenses. The numbers were staggering. Climate control for the vault, $8,000 a month. Insurance premiums, $12,000. Security staff, $15,000. Conservation work, ongoing and expensive. Even with Vivienne's foundation and the steady stream of donations from wealthy patrons who believed in Vance's mission, the costs were barely sustainable. "We can't keep doing this," Thaddeus said, rubbing his temples. "We're 75 and 73 years old. We should be watching game shows and taking naps, not running a museum." Margot looked up from the spreadsheet. "You want to quit?" "I didn't say that," he replied. "I'm saying we need help. Real help. We can't do this alone anymore." Margot knew he was right. They'd been operating on adrenaline and stubbornness for over a year, but bringing in outside help meant giving up control, trusting strangers with Vance's legacy, and that terrified her. The answer came from an unexpected place. One afternoon in late February, a woman in her early 40s walked into the museum. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, glasses, and the kind of efficient energy that suggested she got things done. She introduced herself as Kara Morrison, director of the Heritage Preservation Institute, a non-profit that helped small museums and historical sites become sustainable. "I've been following your story," Kara said as they sat in the library. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable, but I can see you're struggling." Margot bristled. "We're managing." Kara smiled gently. "I'm not here to criticize. I'm here to help. My organization specializes in exactly this, taking extraordinary collections in private hands and helping them transition into permanent public institutions. We handle fundraising, operations, staffing, everything, and we do it without taking control away from the founders." Thaddeus leaned forward. "What would that look like?" Kara pulled out a folder. "We'd establish a board of directors. You'd be on it, obviously, with final say on major decisions. But we'd bring in professionals to handle day-to-day operations, fundraising experts, marketing, education coordinators, people who know how to make a museum not just survive, but thrive." Margot studied the papers. "And you wouldn't change Vance's vision?" "We'd honor it," Kara said. "That's the whole point. Vance spent his life protecting beauty. We'd make sure his work continues for generations." It took 3 weeks of discussion, of reading contracts late into the night, of consulting with Judith Crane and Leonard Wade, but finally Margot and Thaddeus agreed. The Heritage Preservation Institute would partner with the Belmont Preservation Trust. Kara Morrison would become executive director, and Margot and Thaddeus would transition from operators to guardians, overseeing the mission without drowning in logistics. The change was immediate and profound. Kara brought in a development director who secured a $2 million grant from a National Arts Foundation. She hired an education coordinator who developed programs for schools. She brought in a marketing team who redesigned the website and started a social media presence that attracted visitors from around the world. Within 6 months, attendance had tripled. Revenue from admissions and gift shop sales covered operational costs. And for the first time since they'd opened that hidden door, Margot and Thaddeus could breathe. But with success came new complications. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell their story. Major news networks requested interviews. The Smithsonian inquired about borrowing pieces for a special exhibition. Each opportunity was exciting and overwhelming. Margot, who'd spent her career teaching teenagers about Shakespeare and symbolism, now found herself negotiating with producers and curators. It was surreal. One particularly difficult decision came when the Louvre in Paris requested to borrow the Vermeer, Girl with a Water Pitcher, for a retrospective on Dutch masters. The loan would be for 6 months. The painting would be insured for $30 million, and it would introduce Vance's collection to an international audience. But it would also mean that painting, that precious piece of history Vance had saved from destruction, would leave the estate for the first time in over 50 years. Margot wrestled with the decision for weeks. She stood in the gallery staring at the painting, the young woman frozen in her moment of quiet domestic grace, and wondered what Vance would want. Finally, she called a board meeting. "Vance didn't save these pieces to lock them away forever," she said. "He saved them so they could be seen, so they could teach, so they could remind people what beauty looks like. I think he'd want the world to see this." The board voted unanimously. The Vermeer would go to Paris. Watching the painting being carefully packed by white-gloved conservators, surrounded by security, Margot felt like she was saying goodbye to a friend. Thaddeus stood beside her, hand on her shoulder. "It'll come back," he said. "I know," Margot replied. "But what if something happens?" "Then we deal with it," he said. "But we can't protect everything by hiding it. That's not what this is about." She knew he was right. Vance had hidden the collection out of necessity, out of fear that it would be destroyed or stolen. But that time had passed. Now the collection belonged to the world, and the world deserved to see it. The education programs became Margot's favorite part of the museum. Kara had hired a young woman named Isla Brennan, a recent graduate with a degree in art education and boundless enthusiasm. Isla developed programs that brought school groups to the estate 3 times a week. Children walked through the galleries wide-eyed, asking questions, touching interactive displays that explained techniques and history. But the program Margot loved most was the one Isla called Stories Behind the Art. Every piece in the collection came with Vance's documentation: who owned it originally, how it was saved, what it meant. Isla turned those stories into lessons. She showed students a small bronze sculpture from Cambodia and explained how Vance had rescued it from looters during the Khmer Rouge regime. She displayed a manuscript from Syria and told them how Vance had worked with a family fleeing war to preserve their cultural heritage. Each piece wasn't just art. It was a story of courage, of sacrifice, of people who valued beauty enough to risk everything. One Thursday afternoon in October, a high school class from Margot's old school came to visit. She recognized a few of the teachers, now grey and tired like her, who'd once been young colleagues. But it was the students who moved her. They gathered in the foyer, restless and distracted the way teenagers always are, until Isla started talking about Vance. Vance Belmont was an ordinary person, Isla said. He wasn't famous. He didn't have superpowers. But he made a choice. He chose to spend his life protecting things that mattered. And because of that choice, you're standing here today, looking at pieces of history that would otherwise be lost. A girl in the back raised her hand. How much is all this worth? Isla smiled. About $285 million. But that's not really what it's worth. What it's worth is the stories it tells, the beauty it preserves, the lessons it teaches. You can't put a dollar amount on that. The girl considered this. So if you had to choose between selling one painting to make money or keeping it here so people could see it, which would you pick? Isla turned to Margot. Mrs. Finch, you want to answer that? Margot stepped forward, her heart pounding. She wasn't used to speaking in front of groups anymore, even though she'd done it for 43 years. Keeping it here, she said, because money runs out, but beauty, real beauty, that lasts forever. And every person who sees these pieces, who learns these stories, carries that beauty forward. That's worth more than any amount of money. The students were quiet. Then a boy near the front spoke up. Did you know this was all here when you bought the house? Margot shook her head. No, we just bought a broken-down mansion we hoped to fix up. We had no idea what we'd find. Weren't you scared? Another student asked. Terrified, Margot admitted. But sometimes the most important things in life require us to be scared and do them anyway. The students toured the rest of the museum, but that girl from the back lingered. She approached Margot near the end. Mrs. Finch, I'm Sophie. I want to be an art conservator, but my parents say it's not practical, that I should study something that makes money. What should I do? Margot looked at this young girl, eyes bright with hope and doubt, and saw herself 50 years ago. Do what matters to you, Margot said, because you'll spend a lot of years working, and if you don't love what you do, all the money in the world won't make you happy. I taught literature for 43 years, never made much, but I loved it, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Sophie smiled. Thanks. I think I needed to hear that. As the class filed out, Margot stood in the foyer and cried. Thaddeus found her there. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, she said, wiping her eyes. Everything's right. For the first time in a long time, everything's exactly right. The museum's influence rippled outward in ways nobody predicted. The town, which had been dying slowly for decades, began to revive. A coffee shop opened across from the estate entrance, then a bed and breakfast. Then a bookstore specializing in art and history. Tourists who came for the museum stayed for the weekend, ate at local restaurants, shopped at local stores. The mayor, a practical woman named Ellen Reyes, who'd initially been skeptical of the whole project, gave a speech at the town council meeting. 5 years ago, this town was disappearing. Young people were leaving. Businesses were closing. We were becoming a ghost town. Then Margot and Thaddeus Finch bought a condemned mansion for $8,500 and found something nobody expected. And now we have visitors from 20 countries. Our economy has grown 30%. Our schools are getting funding, and people are proud to be from here again. So I want to publicly thank the Finches for taking a risk when everyone thought they were crazy. You saved more than art. You saved us. But success brought new threats. In the spring of the museum's 3rd year, a collector from Dubai offered to buy the entire collection for $400 million. He promised to keep it intact, to display it in a private museum he was building. The offer was delivered by a lawyer in an expensive suit who sat in the boardroom and spoke in the language of contracts and opportunity. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime offer," he said. $400 million. You could set up endowments, fund scholarships, help thousands of students. Think of the good you could do. The board debated for hours. $400 million. It was an incomprehensible amount, the kind of money that could change education across the entire state. Cara Morrison laid out what they could do with those funds: establish free art programs in every school district, create full-ride scholarships for hundreds of students, build conservation labs, fund research. But Margot shook her head. No. The room went quiet. With respect, one of the board members said, "We should at least consider—" "No," Margot said again, more firmly. Vance didn't spend 50 years saving this collection so it could end up in some billionaire's private museum. He wanted it accessible. He wanted it to teach. He wanted ordinary people to see it, not just the wealthy. If we sell it, we betray everything he stood for, and I won't do that. Thaddeus nodded. Margot's right. This isn't about money. It never was. The vote was unanimous. They declined the offer. The collector's lawyer wasn't pleased. You're making a mistake. This museum won't last forever. Eventually, you'll need money, and this offer won't come again. After he left, Cara turned to Margot. You know he's probably right. Maintaining this long-term will be incredibly difficult. I know, Margot said, but some things are worth fighting for, even if it's hard. Over the next year, Margot and Thaddeus threw themselves into making the museum sustainable. They worked with Cara to establish an endowment, slowly building funds through donations and grants. They developed membership programs, creating a community of supporters who believed in the mission. They published a book about Vance's life and the collection, with all proceeds going to the foundation. Slowly, painfully, they built something that could last. Margot's health began to fail in the 4th year. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of age. Her knees ached, her back hurt. She got winded climbing the stairs. The doctor said it was normal for someone her age, but it scared her. What would happen to the museum if she couldn't be there? Who would protect Vance's legacy? Thaddeus wasn't doing much better. He'd developed diabetes and had to carefully monitor his blood sugar. His memory, once sharp enough to calculate complex equations in his head, sometimes failed him now. He'd forget names, lose track of conversations. They didn't talk about it, but both knew their time as guardians was limited. One evening, sitting in the restored garden behind the estate, Margot brought it up. We need to think about succession, about what happens after we're gone. Thaddeus nodded slowly. I know, I've been thinking about it too. Cara's good, Margot said. She understands the mission. And Isla, she has the passion. But they didn't know Vance. They don't feel the weight of this the way we do. Maybe that's okay, Thaddeus said. Maybe the next generation needs to make it their own. We did what we could. We protected it, shared it, built something sustainable. Now we have to trust that what we built will continue. Margot took his hand. I'm scared of letting go. Me too, he admitted. but I'm more scared of holding on so tight that we damage what we're trying to protect." They began mentoring Kara and Isla more intentionally, sharing stories about Vance, explaining the philosophy behind every decision, passing down not just information but wisdom. Kara proved herself again and again, making hard calls that protected the collection while keeping the museum accessible. Isla developed education programs that reached thousands of students each year. Watching them work, Margot began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the legacy would survive without her. The 5th anniversary of the museum's opening was marked with a major event. Dignitaries came from across the country. The Vermeer, which had successfully toured Paris and returned safely, was the centerpiece of a new exhibition about art rescued from conflict. News crews filmed everything, and Margot and Thaddeus, now 78 and 76, stood on the grand staircase and gave a speech to hundreds of people. "5 years ago," Margot began, her voice shaking slightly, "we bought this house for $8,500. We thought we were buying a fixer-upper. We had no idea we were buying a legacy." She looked at Thaddeus, who squeezed her hand. Vance Belmont spent 50 years protecting beauty, protecting history, protecting pieces of humanity that others wanted to destroy or exploit. He did it alone, in secret, believing that someday someone would find what he'd saved and understand why it mattered. We found it, and we did understand. But more than that, we learned something from Vance. We learned that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. And that the most important treasures aren't the ones we keep for ourselves. They're the ones we share. Thaddeus stepped forward. "We're teachers. We spent our careers helping young people learn and grow. And in a way, this museum is the biggest classroom we've ever had. Every person who walks through these doors learns not just about art, but about values, about choosing preservation over profit, about protecting beauty in a world that often destroys it, about standing up for what matters even when it's hard. That's Vance's lesson, and we're honored to be the ones teaching it." The applause was thunderous. People stood, cameras flashed, but Margot barely noticed. She was looking at the paintings on the walls, the sculptures on pedestals, the carefully preserved pieces of human history that Vance had saved and they had shared. And she felt, for the first time in years, that the weight she'd been carrying could finally be set down. The mission would continue without her. The legacy was secure. That night, after everyone had gone home, Margot and Thaddeus walked through the empty museum one last time. They moved slowly from room to room, remembering. The foyer where they'd first found the hidden door, the wine cellar where they'd broken through the brick wall, the vault where $285 million in art had waited in darkness for decades. Upstairs, they visited Vance's study, preserved exactly as he'd left it. His books, his desk, his chair. A photo of him as a young man still sat on the shelf. Margot picked it up. "Do you think he'd be proud?" she asked. Thaddeus smiled. "I think he'd be amazed. He saved all this hoping someone would care. And you didn't just care. You built something that will last long after we're both gone." "We built it," Margot corrected. "Together." "Together," he agreed. They walked out to the garden, which had been fully restored. Marble fountains burbled softly. Flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds. Stone benches sat beneath ancient oak trees. They sat on one of the benches, hand in hand, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Margot asked. "Buying this place? Everything we went through?" Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. "I regret that we didn't sleep much. I regret the stress and the threats and the fear. But the rest of it, finding the collection, protecting it, building the museum, honoring Vance. No, I don't regret any of that. This was the most important thing I've ever done." "Me too," Margot whispered. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell completely. The museum behind them glowed softly, lit from within, a beacon of beauty in the darkness, and Margot thought about how strange life was, how one decision, one $8,500 gamble on a condemned mansion, had led to all of this. They'd been called foolish, reckless, crazy, and maybe they were, but they were also brave, and that bravery had changed everything. Years passed. Margot and Thaddeus gradually stepped back from daily operations, though they visited the museum several times a week. Kara ran things brilliantly, expanding programs, securing funding, building partnerships with museums around the world. Isla's education programs reached over 10,000 students a year. The museum won national recognition, awards, grants. But the real measure of success came in smaller moments, like the day Sophie, the high school student who'd wanted to be a conservator, returned to visit. She was 24 now, finishing her master's degree in art conservation. "I just wanted to thank you," she told Margot. "That day you told me to do what mattered. It changed my life. I'm going to spend my career protecting beauty, just like Vance did, just like you did." Margot hugged her, tears streaming. "Make us proud." "I will," Sophie promised. Or the time a man in his 60s approached Thaddeus during a visit. "You don't remember me," the man said, "but you taught me calculus in 1984. I was failing, and you stayed after school every day for a month to help me. You changed my trajectory. I became an engineer, and now I'm here with my grandkids, showing them what you've built. You've spent your life teaching, and you're still teaching." Thaddeus shook his hand, unable to speak, or the letters that came from around the world, from teachers using the museum's online resources in their classrooms, from families who'd traveled thousands of miles to see pieces of their cultural heritage that Vance had saved, from young people inspired to pursue art, conservation, history, because they'd seen what was possible when someone cared enough to protect beauty. Margot kept every letter in a box in the carriage house. Sometimes, when her knees were too painful to walk much, she'd sit and reread them. Each one reminded her that what they'd done mattered. Not because of the money, not because of the fame, but because they'd taken something precious that had been hidden and shared it with the world. And in doing so, they'd given thousands of people hope, inspiration, purpose. The winters became harder as the years accumulated. Margot's arthritis made even simple tasks painful. She could no longer climb the stairs to the second floor without stopping twice to rest. Thaddeus's diabetes required constant monitoring, and his eyesight had begun to fail. They both knew, without saying it aloud, that their time was growing short. One particularly cold January evening, Margot sat in the carriage house wrapped in blankets, looking through old photographs. Pictures of the estate when they'd first bought it, crumbling and forgotten. Photos of the hidden vault, dusty and sealed. Images of the first pieces they'd uncovered, the Vermeer gleaming under their flashlight. And newer photos, the museum's grand opening, children touching interactive displays, scholars examining Vance's documents, the restored gardens blooming with color. Thaddeus found her there, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, lowering himself carefully into the chair beside her. "I'm not sad," Margot said, wiping her eyes. "I'm grateful. Look at all of this. Look at what we did." He looked at the photos spread across the table. "We had quite an adventure, didn't we?" "The best one," she agreed. "Better than anything I could have imagined when we were just two teachers grading papers and worrying about rent." Thaddeus picked up a photo of them standing in front of the mansion on the day they'd first bought it. They looked so much younger, so uncertain. "We were terrified," he said. "Completely terrified," Margot laughed. "But we did it anyway." "That's always been your superpower," Thaddeus said. "Being scared and doing it anyway." They established a tradition in those final years. Every Sunday afternoon, unless the weather was truly terrible, they would sit in the garden and read aloud from Vance's journals. It became a ritual, a way of keeping his memory alive, of remembering why they'd fought so hard. One particular entry became Margot's favorite, written in December of 1989. Today, a young refugee family came to me with a painting. It had belonged to their grandmother, saved from a burning village, carried across borders, protected through years of displacement. They wanted me to have it, to keep it safe, because they had nothing left and feared it would be lost or sold out of desperation. I bought it from them for more than it was worth, gave them enough money to start over. But what struck me wasn't the painting itself, though it's beautiful. It was their faces when I promised to protect it. Relief, hope, the belief that beauty matters even when everything else is falling apart. That's why I do this. Not for the art itself, but for what it represents. The belief that we can save something precious from the chaos. Margot would read that entry and think about how perfectly it captured Vance's mission. He hadn't been a hoarder or a collector. He'd been a guardian. And now she and Thaddeus had become guardians too. Not just of art, but of his vision. His belief that ordinary people could protect extraordinary things. On their 60th wedding anniversary, the museum threw them a celebration. It was Kara's idea, though Margot protested that it wasn't necessary. But Kara insisted, and on a warm spring evening, the garden filled with people. Former students, museum staff, board members, visitors whose lives had been touched by the collection. Speeches were made, toasts were offered, and Margot and Thaddeus sat at a table under the stars, overwhelmed by the love surrounding them. Isla presented them with a gift from the education department, a book compiled by students who'd visited the museum. Each page contained a drawing, a poem, or an essay about what the collection meant to them. One 9-year-old had written, "Mrs. Margot and Mr. Thaddeus showed me that old people can still do brave things. When I grow up, I want to be brave like them." Another, a teenager, wrote, "I used to think art was boring. Then I learned about Mr. Vance and how he saved all these paintings from wars and bad people. Now I think art is like history you can see, and I think the Finches are heroes for sharing it with us." Margot read every page through tears. When she finished, she looked at Thaddeus. "We did good, didn't we?" "We did great," he replied. But as the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Margot felt exhaustion settle into her bones. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from activity, but from time itself. Thaddeus saw it in her face. "You okay?" "Just tired," she said. "It's been a long day. A long 5 years, a long lifetime, really." He helped her stand, and they walked slowly back to the carriage house. The museum glowed behind them, alive with light and purpose. "I think I'm ready," Margot said quietly. Thaddeus knew what she meant. Me too. They weren't giving up. They were letting go. There was a difference. The work would continue, the mission would endure, but their part in it was coming to an end. And that was okay. The following months brought a gentle settling. Margot and Thaddeus visited the museum less frequently, conserving their energy. But when they did visit, they moved through the galleries with a quiet joy, seeing not just what was there but remembering how it came to be. They made one final important decision. Working with Kara and the board, they established the Finch Fellowship, a program that would bring young people from underserved communities to work at the museum each summer. Participants would learn conservation, curation, education, all the skills needed to protect cultural heritage. "We want this to continue," Margot told the board. "Not just the collection, but the mission. Vance believed ordinary people could do extraordinary things. We proved he was right. Now we need to help the next generation believe it too." The fellowship launched the following summer. 12 young people arrived, nervous and excited, ready to learn. Margot, though her health was declining, insisted on meeting each one. She sat in the library, back straight despite the pain, and looked into their eyes. "You're here because someone believes in you," she told them, "just like someone once believed in Vance and in us. Now you have to believe in yourselves. The work you'll do here matters, not just for this museum, but for the world." One young woman, quiet and shy, raised her hand. "Mrs. Finch, what if we make mistakes? What if we're not good enough?" Margot smiled. "Oh, you'll make mistakes. We made thousands, but that's how you learn. What matters isn't being perfect, it's caring enough to try." The fellows worked hard that summer. They catalogued pieces, assisted with conservation, helped develop new educational materials, and when the program ended, each one left changed, carrying with them the belief that they could make a difference. 3 of them would go on to study art history. 2 would become conservation specialists. 1 would establish a similar museum in her home country. The ripples spread wider than Margot would ever know. As autumn arrived again, painting the estate's trees in gold and red, Margot's health took a serious turn. She caught pneumonia and spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Thaddeus barely left her side. When she finally came home, weaker but determined, she asked Kara to wheel her through the museum one more time. They moved slowly through each gallery. Margot looked at every piece, remembering when they'd first uncovered it, how it felt to realize what Vance had done. In front of the Vermeer, she stopped. "This was the first one that made me cry," she told Kara. "When Dr. Voss told us it had been thought destroyed in the war, and here it was, safe and beautiful. That's when I understood the weight of what we'd found." Kara squeezed her hand. "And you protected it. You shared it. You finished what Vance started." "No," Margot said softly. "We continued it, but it'll never be finished. That's the point. There will always be beauty that needs protecting. Always be people who need to believe in something bigger than themselves. The work goes on." Thaddeus, who'd been walking beside them, added, "We were just one chapter in a longer story. Vance was the first chapter, we were the second. Now you're writing the third." Kara's eyes filled with tears. "I won't let you down." "We know," Margot said. "That's why we trust you." That night, back in the carriage house, Margot and Thaddeus sat together in their worn armchairs, a single lamp glowing between them. They didn't talk much. They'd been together so long that silence was comfortable, a language of its own. But finally, Margot spoke. "When we're gone, do you think anyone will remember us? Or will they just remember Vance and the collection?" Thaddeus considered this. "I think they'll remember that 2 ordinary people did something extraordinary, and that'll matter to someone, somewhere, who needs to believe they can do it too." "Good," Margot said. "That's all I wanted. To matter, to make a difference." "You did," Thaddeus assured her. "We both did." Winter came early that year. By December, snow covered the estate in white, making it look like something from a fairy tale. The museum stayed open, welcoming visitors who marveled at the contrast between the cold outside and the warmth of beauty within. Margot watched from the carriage house window, wrapped in blankets, too weak now to visit in person. But Kara brought her reports every evening. How many visitors came? What questions children asked? Which pieces resonated most? "The Cambodian bronze," Kara said one evening. "A woman stood in front of it for 20 minutes crying. Turns out her family fled the Khmer Rouge. She'd thought all their cultural heritage was lost. Seeing that piece, knowing Vance had saved it, it meant everything to her." Margot smiled. "That's why we did this. Those moments, those connections." "There are hundreds of them," Kara said. "Every single day someone has a moment like that. Your work touches more lives than you'll ever know." On a cold January afternoon, Thaddeus sat beside Margot's bed in the carriage house. She'd been sleeping most of the past week, her breathing shallow, her hand cool in his. The doctor had said it was a matter of days now, maybe hours. But Thaddeus refused to leave. He read to her from Vance's journals. He told her stories about their life together. He reminded her of the day they'd first met, 2 young teachers nervous on their first day of school, bonding over terrible coffee in the faculty lounge. You were wearing a green dress, he said, and you had chalk dust on your nose. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Margot's eyes fluttered open. Liar, she whispered, but she was smiling. I was terrified. So was I, he admitted, but we figured it out together. We figured everything out together, she said. That's how it's supposed to work. She squeezed his hand weakly. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll keep visiting the museum, keep telling our story, keep making sure Vance's mission continues. I promise, Thaddeus said, tears streaming down his face. And promise me, she continued, that when your time comes, you won't be sad. We had a good life, a meaningful life. We did something that mattered. The best life, he agreed. Margot closed her eyes again. I'm not scared. I know, Thaddeus said. You've never been scared of anything. I've been scared of everything, she corrected. I just did it anyway. She was quiet for so long that Thaddeus thought she'd fallen asleep. But then she spoke once more, so softly he had to lean in to hear. We finished it, didn't we? Vance's work. We finished it. We did, Thaddeus assured her. We absolutely did. Margot Adelaide Finch passed away peacefully that evening, with Thaddeus holding her hand and snow falling softly outside the window. She was 83 years old. The funeral was held at the museum, in the grand ballroom that she and Vance had, in their own ways, saved. Hundreds attended. Former students, museum staff, visitors whose lives had been touched, young people who'd participated in the fellowship program. Kara gave the eulogy. Margot Finch wasn't famous before she bought a condemned mansion for $8,500. She was a retired teacher living on a fixed income, worried about rent and groceries. But she had something more valuable than money. She had courage. And when she found Vance Belmont's hidden collection, she didn't see dollar signs. She saw responsibility. She saw beauty that needed protecting. And she spent the last years of her life making sure that beauty would endure. Margot proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that you don't need wealth or power to change the world. You just need to care, and to be brave, and to refuse to quit. She was a teacher her entire life, and her final lesson, the one she taught all of us, is this: the greatest treasures aren't the ones we keep, they're the ones we share. Thaddeus sat in the front row, listening to the words, crying quietly. After the service, people came up to offer condolences. He shook hands and accepted hugs, but he felt hollow. Margot had been his partner for 60 years, his best friend, his courage when he had none, and now she was gone. In the weeks that followed, Thaddeus struggled. He'd promised Margot he would keep visiting the museum, keep telling their story. But walking through those galleries without her felt impossible. Every painting reminded him of the day they'd uncovered it together. Every piece held a memory of her voice, her determination, her unwavering belief that they were doing something important. Kara visited him daily, bringing soup, checking on him, making sure he wasn't giving up. She wouldn't want you to stop living, Kara said gently. I know, Thaddeus replied. But I don't know how to do this without her. You're not without her, Kara said. She's in every room of that museum, every piece of that collection, every student who visits and learns something that changes their life. Margot's not gone, she's everywhere. Slowly, painfully, Thaddeus began to heal. He started visiting the museum again, first once a week, then twice, then almost daily. He'd sit on the bench in the garden, the one where he and Margot had sat so many times, and he'd talk to her, telling her about new exhibits, new visitors, new stories. And sometimes, in the quiet, he felt her presence, not literally, but in the way the light fell through the windows, in the sound of children laughing in the galleries, in the knowledge that they'd built something that would outlast them both. One afternoon in late spring, Thaddeus sat in Vance's study, looking at the journal behind glass. He thought about 3 lives intertwined by this place. Vance, who'd built the collection. Margot, who'd shared it with the world. And himself, who'd been blessed to witness it all. Kara found him there. "You okay?" "Yeah," Thaddeus said, "just thinking about how strange life is. If Margot hadn't seen that flyer, if we hadn't been desperate enough to take a risk, if we'd listened to everyone who said we were crazy, none of this would have happened." "But you did take the risk," Kara said, "and because of that, thousands of people have been inspired, educated, changed." Thaddeus nodded. Margot used to say that Vance was waiting for someone to find his work, someone who'd care enough to protect it. I think she was right, and I think Vance would be proud of what we did. "I know he would be," Kara said. Thaddeus lived for another year after Margot's death. He spent his days at the museum, becoming a beloved presence. Children knew him as Mr. Thaddeus, the man with stories about how the collection was found. Scholars sought his input on decisions about conservation and display, and every evening he'd sit in the garden on that bench and talk to Margot about his day. He passed away peacefully in his sleep one October night, exactly 6 years after they'd first opened the hidden door. He was 87 years old. At his funeral, held once again in the ballroom, Isla spoke. Thaddeus Finch taught mathematics for 42 years. He was patient, kind, and believed every student could learn if given the right support. But his greatest lesson wasn't about equations or formulas. It was about partnership, about supporting the person you love to do extraordinary things. Margot was brave, but Thaddeus was her foundation. He believed in her when she doubted herself. He stood beside her when others called her crazy. He helped her build something that will last forever. And now they're together again, and their legacy lives on. The museum established a memorial in their honor, a simple plaque in the foyer next to Vance's. It read, "Margot Adelaide Finch and Thaddeus James Finch. Teachers, guardians, believers. They found beauty hidden in darkness and gave it to the world. Their courage reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." Years passed. The museum thrived. The collection continued to inspire, educate, transform. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the last visitors had left, staff members swore they could feel presences in the building. Not scary, but comforting. 3 souls who dedicated their lives to protecting beauty, still watching over the place they'd saved. Anyone can change the world if they're willing to take a risk, work hard, and refuse to give up on what matters. As the evening stars appeared above the Belmont estate, the museum stood as a testament to 3 extraordinary lives. Vance Belmont, who saved beauty in secret. Margot and Thaddeus Finch, who shared that beauty with the world. They proved that ordinary people, armed with courage and conviction, can accomplish the extraordinary. They showed that the greatest treasures aren't measured in dollars, but in impact, in lives touched, in beauty preserved, in legacy left behind. Because for Vance, for Margot, for Thaddeus, and for everyone their story inspired, the greatest treasure was never what they found. It was what they chose to do with it. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some dreams are meant to be shared.